For 30 years, a single man lived in total isolation on a sheer, volcanic speck of rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. He had no right hand, he had no nose, he had no ears, and he had chosen to be there. Abandoned in 1516 on the uninhabited island of St. Helena, he survived driving ocean storms, the phantom agony of his mutilated body, and the crushing, profound silence of being utterly alone. Long before the French Emperor Napoleon was banished to this exact same island, it was the sanctuary of a ghost. This is a true story, not about surviving a shipwreck or conquering nature, but about the terrifying weight of human shame and the extreme lengths a man will go to escape the eyes of the world. His name was Fernão Lopes. When he finally emerged from the dense, jagged interior of the island, he was not the traitor the Portuguese Empire had condemned. What he knew, with chilling clarity, was that the greatest hell a man can experience is not isolation, but the judgment of his fellow man. To understand why a man would willingly bury himself alive on a desert island, you have to understand the horrific violence that stripped him of his humanity. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese Empire was violently carving out a monopoly in the Indian Ocean. Fernão Lopes was a soldier under the command of the ruthless General Afonso de Albuquerque. During a brutal campaign in Goa, India, Lopes did the unthinkable. He defected. He converted to Islam and sided with the local defenders against his own countrymen. But Albuquerque returned and Goa fell. The punishment for treason was not a quick execution. It was absolute, spectacular destruction. Albuquerque ordered Lopes to be made into a living, grotesque monument to betrayal. Soldiers tied Lopes down in the scorching Indian heat. With heavy iron blades, they chopped off his right hand. Then they severed the thumb of his left hand. But they did not stop there. They took knives to his face, brutally slicing away his ears and his nose, scraping the cartilage down to the skull. Lopes survived the blood loss, but his life was over. He was a monster, a mutilated freak, unable to feed himself properly, unable to look in a mirror, condemned to bear the physical scars of his sins for the rest of his life. He was thrown into the dark, rotting hull of a galleon bound for Lisbon, meant to be paraded through the streets of Portugal as a disgraced beggar. But as the ship crossed the vast, empty expanse of the South Atlantic, it dropped anchor to take on fresh water at a newly discovered, uninhabited volcanic island called St. Helena. When the crew went ashore, Lopes saw his only chance. Driven by a psychological agony far worse than his physical wounds, he threw himself from the ship. He scrambled up the sheer, black basalt cliffs, hiding deep in the dense, tangled forests of the interior. The sailors searched for him, but the island was a fortress of ravines and fog. Eventually, the wind caught the sails, the ship disappeared over the horizon, and Fernão Lopes was alone. St. Helena is a jagged, towering monolith jutting out of a restless ocean. It is a fortress of sheer, black basalt cliffs, swept by howling trade winds that carry the sharp scent of salt, sulfur, and bird guano. For the first year, survival was an agonizing, clumsy torture. Fernão Lopes was not a whole man. He had no right hand. He was missing the thumb on his left. His face was a raw, scarred crater. The phantom pains were blinding. In the damp, freezing South Atlantic nights, he would feel an agonizing itch on a nose that no longer existed, or the sudden, sharp cramp of fingers that had been chopped off months ago. He found a small, dark cave carved deep into the volcanic rock to escape the driving, horizontal rain. But shelter was not enough. He was starving. Imagine trying to conquer the wilderness with only 4 fingers. He had no fire, no tools, and no clothes other than the rotting rags from the ship. He could not grip a branch to fashion a spear. He could not tie a knot to make a trap. He was forced to drop to his knees and dig in the wet dirt for roots using his 4 remaining fingers and the bleeding, callous stump of his right arm. He scavenged along the jagged shoreline, crushing sea snails with rocks he had to lift by pressing them between his forearms. He drank from mountain streams by plunging his ruined face directly into the freezing water, gasping for air because he had no nasal cavity to breathe through. The psychological torment was far worse than the starvation. In the deafening, crushing silence of the island, his mind became a torture chamber. The howling of the wind sounded like the cheers of the soldiers in Goa. When he accidentally caught his reflection in a still pool of water, the monstrous, disfigured freak staring back at him reinforced his toxic, suffocating shame. He believed he was in hell and that he deserved it. When Portuguese galleons occasionally anchored in the bay to take on fresh water, Lopes did not run to the beach waving his arms for rescue. He fled in absolute terror. He scrambled up the steepest, most treacherous ravines, tearing the skin off his knees and stumps, hiding in the mud like a frightened animal. He would watch the pristine, unblemished sailors from the shadows of the canopy. He would rather die of starvation in the dirt than let humanity look at his mutilated face again. But the sailors knew he was there. They saw his clumsy, desperate footprints in the mud. They saw the remnants of his miserable meals. And then something extraordinary happened. The sailors didn't hunt him. Out of a profound, quiet pity, they began to leave things behind on the beach before they sailed away. A rusted iron knife, a canvas shirt, a small bag of seeds, a tinderbox, a few hard ship's biscuits. For a man who had been literally butchered by his own people, these small, silent acts of grace were a psychological earthquake. Humanity had destroyed him, but humanity was now keeping him alive. With these tools, the mutilated soldier began to fundamentally change. The terrified, feral creature died in that cave, and a master of the island emerged. Holding the flint with his 4 fingers and striking it with the stump of his right arm, he finally sparked the tinderbox. Fire roared to life, the warm smoke curling up into the cold Atlantic sky, pushing back the darkness. With the seeds, he planted gourds, pomegranates, and palm trees, meticulously clawing the volcanic soil to create a hidden, thriving garden in the middle of the wasteland. With the tinderbox, he finally made fire, the smoke curling up into the Atlantic sky. With the seeds, he planted gourds, pomegranates, and palm trees, using his 4 fingers to meticulously claw the volcanic soil. He found his salvation not in a priest, but in a drowning bird. A rooster had fallen overboard from a passing Portuguese caravel and washed ashore, half dead, battered by the surf. Lopes scrambled down the jagged rocks and scooped it up with his one good hand. He fed it. He warmed it. The bird became his absolute shadow. It followed him through the steep, volcanic ravines, its bright feathers a stark contrast against the black basalt. It perched on his shoulder while he tended his garden. It ate seeds directly out of his mangled, 4-fingered palm. For a man who had been violently, surgically cast out by humanity, the unconditional companionship of this animal was a profound psychological anchor. The rooster didn't care that he had no nose. It didn't judge his missing ears or his severed hand. It just saw him. As the years bled into a decade, the toxic, suffocating shame evaporated. The island stopped being a prison and became a sanctuary. The wind did not mock him. The roaring ocean did not care about his treason. He found a deep, unshakable spiritual peace in the crushing isolation that no church could ever provide. And then the ultimate test arrived. 10 years after he first threw himself off the ship, another Portuguese galleon dropped anchor in the bay. But this time, Lopes did not scramble up the cliffs. He did not hide in the mud. He walked out of the dark tree line and stood in the open on the black sand beach. When the landing party rowed ashore, the sailors stopped dead in their tracks, their hands hovering over their swords. Before them stood a living ghost, a man dressed in roughly woven palm fronds and animal skins. His face was a terrifying, hollowed-out skull covered in scarred, weather-beaten flesh. He had no right hand. The captain approached cautiously. Lopes tried to speak, but after a decade of absolute silence, his vocal cords had completely atrophied. His voice was entirely gone, replaced by a soft, guttural hum that sounded like the wind through the ravines. But the captain recognized him. The legend of the mutilated hermit of St. Helena was whispered across every ship in the Atlantic. The captain lowered his weapon and delivered incredible news. The King of Portugal had issued a full royal pardon. Lopes was no longer a traitor. He was free to come home. Stepping onto the wooden galleon was a violent sensory assault. The stinging smell of unwashed bodies and tar, the claustrophobic lower decks, the deafening shouting of the crew. It was terrifying to a man who had only listened to the ocean for 10 years. But Lopes endured it because he had a mission. He bypassed the comforts of Portugal and made a grueling, agonizing pilgrimage on foot to Rome. He wanted ultimate, divine absolution. In 1530, the impossible happened. The faceless, one-handed hermit stood in the opulent, gold-plated halls of the Vatican. He was granted a private audience with Pope Clement VII. The visual contrast was staggering. The most powerful man in Europe, draped in heavy velvet and priceless jewels, sitting across from a mutilated outcast. The Pope listened to his confession. Through an interpreter, formally absolved him of the sin of apostasy, and then asked Lopes what his heart most desired. He could have asked for a quiet, wealthy monastery. He could have asked for a pension of gold for the rest of his life. Lopes looked at the Pope. He communicated his one desperate wish. He didn't want their gold, he didn't want their pity, and he certainly didn't want their society. He asked for only one thing: to be put on a ship and sent back to his empty island. The Pope, moved by the man's profound detachment from the world, granted his wish. Fernão Lopes boarded a ship and turned his back on Europe forever. He left behind the gold, the royal courts, and the oppressive, perfumed air of the 16th century elite. The voyage back took months, but the moment the jagged, black basalt peaks of St. Helena broke through the Atlantic fog, Lopes felt something he hadn't felt in a lifetime. He felt relief. When he stepped off the wooden boat and his bare feet touched the dark volcanic sand, the sensory shock of the island welcomed him home. The deafening, judgmental chatter of the cities was instantly replaced by the rhythmic, thunderous crashing of the surf. The stench of crowded, unwashed European streets was washed away by the clean, salt-heavy wind of the ocean. He climbed back up the sheer ravines. He returned to his dark cave. He found the remnants of his garden, overgrown but surviving. He was no longer a frightened, mutilated freak hiding in the mud from passing ships. He was the undisputed master of his own silent universe. He had faced the absolute pinnacle of human power, the King of Portugal and the Pope of Rome, and he had looked them in the eye and consciously rejected everything they had to offer. Lopes lived on St. Helena in perfect, unbroken solitude for another 20 years. When ships stopped for water, he no longer hid in terror. He would sometimes leave fresh vegetables from his garden on the beach for the sick sailors, a silent, faceless ghost offering charity to the world that had butchered him. But he never boarded their ships again. In 1545, alone in his cave, listening to the eternal roar of the Atlantic wind, Fernão Lopes closed his eyes and died peacefully in the dirt. His story forces us to look in the mirror and confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about human nature. We view exile as the ultimate punishment. We are biologically wired to terrified of being cast out by our tribe. We spend our entire lives terrified of how we are perceived, constantly adjusting ourselves to avoid the judgment, the mockery, and the shame of society. But for Lopes, society was the hell that mutilated him, and the wild was the heaven that put his soul back together. He realized that the island didn't demand he be beautiful. The trees didn't care about his past mistakes. Nature allowed him to just exist. He didn't need our forgiveness, and he didn't want our pity. He only needed a place where the world could no longer look at him. It leaves us with a haunting reflection. In our desperate, exhausting daily struggle to be accepted by the crowd, what quiet, peaceful parts of our own souls are we slowly carving away? If you found this story compelling, please hit the like button. It really helps these historical documentaries reach more people. And subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history and the extraordinary limits of human endurance. Thanks for watching.